have Valerie Feathers, who's the outreach coordinator for the Louisiana Division of Archaeology. Valerie, what does the outreach coordinator do?
So the outreach coordinator does a little bit of everything. I'm responsible for creating teacher kits and sending them out to schools, for going into schools and giving presentations to Rotary clubs and nonprofits, really getting the word out about what archaeology is, what archaeology in Louisiana is, and teaching about our sites in Louisiana, be they prehistoric like Poverty Point or historic like some of our New Orleans sites, as well as coordinate archaeological events throughout the year.
Yeah, that sounds like a busy job. So
yeah,
tell me,
quite the busy one.
what are you going to talk to us about today?
Well, today we're going to talk about the Poverty Point World Heritage Site.
Great. Well, let's get started.
Okay. The Poverty Point World Heritage Site is unlike any other site in the world, and we're going to talk about why that is for several different reasons. The Poverty Point World Heritage Site is located in West Carroll Parish. It's near the town of Epes. Now, this is in northeast Louisiana, and it's about as far northeast as you can get before hitting Arkansas. The occupational time span is 1700 BC to 1100 BC, which is about 3,500 years ago. People at the site lived there for roughly 600 years. Now, at the time, this was the largest earthworks in North America, which makes it pretty impressive in my book. We're going to talk about several reasons why the site is unique, and I don't use that word lightly because I think it gets used too often, but in this case, it is very appropriate. And one of the ways in which the site is unique is its occupational period. So when we talk about that 600-year time span and we look at the archaeological sequence, we have evidence of hunting and gathering. We have found animal bones that consist of largely fish remains, so the Bayou Mason's right there. So people were obviously fishing in the area, but we also have remains of alligator, of frog, of turtle, of deer. And then when we think about gathering, we think of hickory nuts, aquatic tubers, and fruits and other wild foods that were available at the site. Now notice I did not say that there are any evidence of corn or squash or bean. And that's because for the entire 600 years that people lived at the site, they never planted any type of food that we have found. So there's no domesticated agriculture. And that's just one of the many ways in which the site is unique, is that it is the largest site that we know of that is largely hunter-gatherer, that is hunter-gatherer. These are mound builders who solely hunted and gathered for their food, and we don't see that anywhere else. Now, throughout the slides, we're going to talk a little bit about the mounds. That's what we're going to see first. We're going to go through all of the mounds, and then we're going to go through the trade part, which always gets everyone very excited because you get to see the artifacts. So the mounds were primarily built, we think, for ceremonial purposes. And what you see here in the upper left-hand corner are native peoples taking dirt from a borrow pit, putting them in baskets, and then taking them to their designated site so they could build the mound. In the bottom right-hand picture, we have a portrait of native peoples attending a ceremony in the plaza area. And this is one of my favorite maps of Poverty Point because when I talk about the mounds, and when I talk about the plaza areas, and I talk about the ridges, in my mind, they're very vivid because I've visited Poverty Point frequently, fairly often throughout the year. However, it's very hard to see if you don't know what you're looking at or looking for. So we have a LiDAR map. Now, LiDAR is light detection and ranging, and this can read and measure features on the surface of the Earth. Now, what happens with LiDAR is that it's a form of technology that uses light as laser pulses to make a three-dimensional image of the Earth's surface. And you do this by flying over the site, utilizing your LiDAR. You send out those laser pulses, and they go through the trees, through the grass, through the brush, they hit the ground, and they record what's on the surface of the Earth. And that's what you see here in this map. You can see the mounds, Mound F at the very top. If we go to the left-hand side, Mound B, Mound A, Mound E. Then we go toward the middle, you have the ridges. You have the plaza, Mound C and Mound D. Now, Mound D we're not going to talk about because it was built about 2,000 years after the Poverty Point peoples. Everything else we're going to talk about. And we're going to kick it off with Mound B. I'm not going in alphabetical order. Instead, I chose to go in chronological order, and Mound B is our oldest mound at the site. radiocarbon dated samples indicate it was built around 1600 BC. It's roughly 20 feet tall by about 180 feet at its base. Now, I'm going to, for this particular mound, talk about construction phases because it's very interesting. Archaeologists can read soil kind of like you read a book. And so when we do excavations where we take soil samples, the dirt is really our best friend. And this is how we figure out how sites are built. And here we're seeing that this particular mound was built in 7 construction phases. Some of the floors had fire pits or charcoal, they had post holes. So this is a very active portion of the site. Now, in at least 3 of these construction phases, the top of the mound was left flat. And as you can see, it looks pretty rounded now. But for the first 3 construction phases, it was just flat. In the final construction phase is when it was rounded off, okay? And this was discovered in 1955 when James Ford excavated the mound. He found brown circular stains with the impressions of basket weaves. Now, the baskets were no longer there, but those weaves were left as impressions on the dirt. Now, this happens when the basket is left there and then covered over. And that's what we're seeing in the final construction of this mound is Native American peoples actually filling the baskets with dirt, layering them on top of this mound and then capping it over with dirt. Okay. Now, when we often ask how we can tell how much dirt was used to build a mound. And we're going to talk about that throughout this presentation. I'm going to throw out some numbers, but we're going to start here. And really, James Ford was the one that did this. From the size of the stains, he estimated that the average basket container would have held about 50 pounds of dirt. For this particular mound alone, now remember this mound is only about 20 feet tall, okay, about 180 feet at its base. For this particular mound alone, it would have taken 6,970 tons or 278,000 basket loads of dirt to build, which is incredibly impressive 3,500 years ago. That's incredibly impressive today. Mound E is next, and Mound E is flat top. So when we talked about Mound B and I talked about a flat top mound, if you'll look at the LiDAR image in the upper right-hand corner, that is Mound E. That is a flat top mound. This mound was first identified by C.B. Moore in 1913. So we've known this site existed for a long time. So it was first discovered in 1911. Excavations began in 1913 with C.B. Moore. However, this mound was kind of in a conundrum. It was in a weird place. So Moore identified it. He called it a mound in 1913. When Ford came around in 1954, he didn't even include it in the maps. The landowner at the time, well, about 20 years later, the landowner leveled it around 1974, 1975. And then William Hague came and took core samples in 75 and said, well, you know, this is a naturally occurring landmark. You know, this isn't a man-made mound. But John Gibson and Arville Touché came back in 1983, and again in 1993 and took core samples. And they found that, yes, this was an artificially constructed mound. So this was not a mound on the natural landscape. It's actually about 13 feet tall, having been leveled. It's 300 feet by 260 feet at its base, so fairly wide. And if you look at the LiDAR image, it looks like it has a little ramp on the north part of it. We're not sure if that ramp was built by Poverty Point peoples or if it was built by historic peoples. We just don't know. We've never found artifacts, diagnostic artifacts in the mound. And we think that it's one of the earliest mounds built right around the time of Mound B, so that's 1600 BC mark. Now, Mound A is the next mound we're going to talk about. Obviously, Mound A is the most recognizable mound at Poverty Point. It is the largest by far, and it was the largest in the United States up until the time of Cahokia. So Monk's Mound at Cahokia is the largest mound, with Mound A at Poverty Point being the second largest. Now, the picture you see here is taken about halfway up. Okay, so that shows you just the scale of how enormous this mound is. Surprisingly, it was one of the last built mounds. So this mound was built around 1300 BC, the second to last mound built at the site. It measures about 72 feet tall, which is about as tall as a 6 or 7 story building. The platform on the top measures about 30 feet. Now, what's most impressive, though, is just the size. So 710 feet east to west by 660 feet north to south. So it's a massive mound. It took over 8.4 million cubic feet of dirt to build. Now, if you think about it and apply our calculations that Forty gave us, each basket weighing about 5 pounds, that's 15.5 million basket loads of dirt. 15.5 basket loads, 390,000 tons of dirt. Now, for those of you who are like me and have no concept of how much dirt that actually is, if you think of a dump truck, that's 15,000 dump truck loads. That's incredible. That's a lot of dirt, okay? Now, as we go through with Mound A, many people think that this is our burial mound or this is where all the artifacts are, and that's really not the case. There's no evidence that burials were found here. And if there were, they would have done in Mound B, as that's a conical mound, and that's the shape of most burial mounds, just that nice conical, that round shape. But that's not the case either. No burials. And in fact, for the entire 600-year time span, there were no burials ever. We've never been able to find a burial at the site. So that in and of itself is just mysterious. We don't know where these people went. We have found very few artifacts in the fill in Mound A. Perhaps the most astounding thing I can say about this mound is the time in which it was built. So Anthony Ortman and T.R. Kidder used soil core data and historic rainfall data to calculate the time it would have taken to build Mound A. And they found that if you had enough people and enough preparation, that this mound could have been built in 90 days. That's 3 months, which is just amazing because they found that this is a single construction. So we've talked about, 6 stages and 7 stages and 3 stages. Mound A was built all at once. It was one and done. They didn't stop. Okay? So it could have taken 90 days to build, which is just mind-blowing to me. It boggles my mind. Mound C is my favorite mound at the site, and that's because it shows 2 different things. Okay, it's located in the plaza, and it's about 6 feet tall, so it's pretty small. It's 80 feet wide by about 260 feet long. It was originally cone-shaped, although it doesn't look much like a cone now. That's because of what happened in the 1800s. I get asked all the time, how did the site get its name? What was going on at Poverty Point? Where did the site name come from? Well, it actually came from the plantation that was here in the 1800s. There was a historic plantation called Poverty Point Plantation. So during this time, you had horse-drawn wagons that traveled a dirt road that went over top of Mound C. And this wore a deep rut in the mound. And that's what you see in this photo. You actually see the 1800 wagon wheel mark going through that mound. So you have a historic event coupled with a prehistoric event, which to me is my favorite thing to see in the archaeological record. I completely geek out over things like that. So this is why my favorite mound at Mound C. Now, Mound F is actually pretty cool. It was the last mound to be found, and it was found in 2013 by none other than station archaeologist Dr. Diana Greenlee. And she was to the northeast corner of the park to gather GPS map. And when she was walking there, she followed the fence line, which is the correct route. And on the way back, she changed her mind and decided she was going to follow the bayou. And as she was walking back, she was thinking over events of the day, and she looked up and there's the mound. And it was about 18 months until she had the opportunity to come back. And when she did, she contacted Thurman Allen, who's a soil scientist, and said, hey, do you want to come and take some core samples? Let's figure out if this was a natural mound or an artificially constructed mound. And sure enough, it was one of the Poverty Point mounds. So it is artificially constructed. It is the smallest mound at Poverty Point. It's only 5 feet tall. It's 80 feet by 100 feet at its base, and radiocarbon dates indicate that it was the last mound built at Poverty Point. It dates to 1280 BC. What you see here, again, is that LiDAR image we talked about on the right, but on the left is an image that I love. And it is an aerial photograph from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Now, there is a story that goes with this that I'm going to read, and it won't take long, I promise. So, it is in Jenny Ellerby and Diana Greenlee's book, Poverty Point, Revealing the Forgotten City. And it's an excerpt from a 19 seminar by William Hay he gave at Louisiana State University. And this is what he said. Talking about this idea of how Poverty Point was discerned as being a great earthworks. We really didn't realize there was this big earthworks until I went up in April of '53 to meet James Ford. He came down from New York and we were going to plan what to do the summer of '53. And he stopped at the Corps of Engineer headquarters in Vicksburg and picked up some aerial photographs. So I met him at our normal meeting place, the Hilltop Motel in Delhi, and also, as was normal, after 2 drinks, he produced these aerial photographs. My gosh, here was this earthwork showing up, and he said, "You know where that site is?" And I said, "Well, it's got to be in the Ohio River Valley. No place except that area in the east where you get these complex earthworks like that." Well, he said, "You've walked all over that site." Then, not I. I've been on that site. And then I looked closer. And that's Poverty Point. And of course, we've known about Poverty Point since 1911 as a site, but not earthworks were there. So you see, the earthworks from above are very distinguishable. You can see them in the aerial photograph and you can see them in the LiDAR. However, when you're on the ground, it's a bit of a different story. This is what they look like on the ground. And they are so large spanning, they span the entire site, that they're really hard to discern because they're only a couple of inches tall in some places to about 6 feet tall in some places. Originally, we thought that the ridges were probably 6 to 9 feet tall or more, but time has a way of wearing things down. And 3,500 years is a long time, and a lot happens during that time. However, if we look at the tilt of the landscape, we actually see that the north part of the site is lower than the southern part of the site. And the ridges in the north are more pronounced. So we think that people would have built up that northern part of the site to be on par with that southern part. And the innermost ridges are actually the tallest. Now, habitation debris found during excavations tell us that people live on the ridges, right? So this is where we think people constructed not necessarily houses. I don't want to say that because the post holes don't lend themselves to house structures. They're not exactly round. They're not exactly square. They're not exactly rectangular. But we do know that household activities took place on top of the mounds. So now we get to the fun stuff, as the kids call it, which are the artifacts. And another way in which the Poverty site is very unique, and if I can back up for just a second, let me say this, that there's no other site in the world that has the ridge system quite like the one at Poverty Point. So there's another unique aspect of that site is we see not only mountain construction, but ridge construction at the same site, which is just, it's very odd. But it exists, and it exists at Poverty Point. And what else exists at Poverty Point is the massive trade network that we see. And we only really see this in the Hopewell culture. And obviously Poverty Point predates that, but we see this massive trading network. And we're seeing artifacts come from as far away as Iowa. I mean, that's 650 miles away from Poverty Point. Now we see galena coming from Iowa. We see gray northern flint coming from Indiana. We have Mill Creek Chert and galena coming from Missouri, Pickwick Chert coming from Tennessee, Novaculite hematite and magnetite, quartz crystal from Arkansas. From the east, we see steatite and schist from Georgia. We see Tallahassee quartzite from Alabama. And the only things that are considered local, and I use that term loosely here, is the citronelle gravel, which we're going to talk about here in just a couple of slides. And that's as far away as 25 or 30 miles. And then the Catahoula sandstone, which is to the south. The only thing local to Poverty Point is the clay itself, which is fascinating because we found 78 tons of stone here, and it's all imported. Because